teachers. What are the 4 things I need to know before making a lesson plan? And then we'll jump into how do I make the lesson plan? Number 1, what am I actually going to be teaching? So I have my notes here and I know what I'm going to be teaching in this video. So keep in mind that it's important to know what you're going to be teaching. What do my students need to learn? What skill are they supposed to be learning for this lesson? I've made the mistake of finding a really cool lesson on Teachers Pay Teachers or something on Pinterest, and I'm like getting it ready for the next day, and I'm like, this isn't really specific on what my students are supposed to be doing. So I always encourage you to really know, what skill do my students need to know for this lesson? What skill am I actually going to be teaching? 2, know what you're going to be doing ahead of time. Obviously, right? You think, well, obviously, how else would I teach it? But I will tell you, sometimes you run out of time, or you think, oh, it's in the curriculum, I'll just follow it. You need to make that lesson, and you need to know what you're doing ahead of time. So, for example, you'll notice when I made the Making Predictions video, there was sticky notes in that because I had gone through and knew what I was going to be teaching ahead of time. Okay? When you're teaching, there's a lot going on. You have maybe some students are whispering. You have to go be like, hey, we're doing a lesson right now. I need you guys to listen. The phone rings. The student has to leave. Something comes on the intercom and you've lost your train of thought, right? But I know I planned ahead, so I have my sticky notes and I'm not too overwhelmed with what's going on, okay? So as much as we love curriculums and they help us keep sane so we don't have to plan everything, even if you're following a curriculum, make sure you have already looked at the assignment and looked what the students need to be doing. That way you know how to go about planning. 3, assume the students know nothing. Okay, that sounds weird. I'm going to say it again. Assume the students know nothing. I can't tell you how many meetings I was in, and there would be teachers so frustrated, and they'd be like, how could they not know this? And I'd ask them, did you teach it? No, they should know what they're doing. Well, they don't. So instead of getting frustrated, just assume they know nothing. And there is nothing wrong with that. If I'm teaching problem in a story, I'm going to assume they never have learned problem before. Okay. So especially in math can be really tricky for some students. So even if I'm teaching how to add fractions, I'm going to, again, cover what a fraction is first. So assume they know nothing. This will keep you from losing your mind at the end of a lesson. And if you spend a little bit of extra time in the beginning, you won't have to fix all those misconceptions later on. So spend that time in the beginning, really important. And number 4, make mistakes. There are so many times I have tried different things, try to keep kids more interacting more, and I try different things and it just does not go well, and that's okay. The fun part about teaching is I believe it's an art, so you just keep making mistakes. Totally normal. It happens. Try different things. Some things seem fun until you do them and you're like, meh. Some things you try and you're like, hey, that worked out great. So make mistakes, part of teaching. Don't beat yourself up. All you can do is reflect and do it differently. All right, next part, how to make a lesson plan or a lesson. Let's jump into that part. Let's talk about mini lessons. Mini lessons are about 10 to 20 minutes, and they are how I teach certain skills. So a mini lesson is a way for me to model what I'm going to teach. It also helps the student participate and be active learners. And lastly, it doesn't take that long. I know you as an adult sitting in a college class or listening to a lecture, after about 20 minutes, you're not really paying attention. We can't expect the same result from our students. So realistically, kids are only going to be active for about 20 minutes. So we want to ensure that lessons are short, sweet, and simple. And then if I have to fix any misconceptions or I have to work with students, I do that with small groups. So I'm not trying to get to every learner in a mini lesson. I'm trying to teach the skill as best I can, and then later on I can pull those students back to the table to work with them if they need it. So I like the teacher model. I'm going to model, we do. Okay, so we do this as a whole class. I have them active learners while I'm teaching here and there. And then lastly, you do. So this is going to be my formative or my summative assessment on mini lessons. All right, I have in the description a model of what this looks like, and we're going to go through it together. You can download it and use it yourself. You can use a different format. I personally don't have anything shiny and pretty. I like simple, clean, cut, easy, because realistically, you're the only one looking at this, and I just want a same format, and we'll talk a little bit about how this also helps with classroom management. So when I have a foundational lesson plan, meaning this is how I teach most of my lessons, my students are going to come in and they're already going to know what is to be expected. So my students already knew I was going to model the skill. They knew they had to be active learners while I was modeling the skill, and then they knew that afterwards they'd be rating their thinking and learning, and then they'd either be working with a partner independently or with me. So they already knew how this works. If every day I'm making some different lesson, I'm going to have to reteach my expectations, because classroom management, I would say, is one of the most important things to have in order to teach. So by using a foundational model like the mini lesson model, I know that my students are going to know what to expect from me and what I expect from them. Is it great to have an amazing lesson here and there that's different? Yes. But if we are teaching Monday through Friday, I also want to make sure my lessons and my lesson plan is consistent. So again, simple, easy. I can quickly write it out if I want to, or type it out, and it's done. So that way I'm not spending this huge amount of time on every lesson that I'm going to have to reteach. So make it simple and easy for yourself. All right, let's move into looking at the template together on mini guided lesson plan. So the method I use is teacher modeling or student-centered, and I am also thinking out loud, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like later on. And then I want my standard and skill. What skill specifically are my students going to be learning in this lesson? Objectives. You want to make sure that you are setting goals throughout your lesson. So that way the students, one, know what they're learning, and two, you stick to it. So a couple ways to do this that are really easy for yourself. One, you can type out, I can determine, and have a blank space, and then you can laminate this, and then you'll have it somewhere in your room, and you just write out, I can determine problem 1 week, and then you erase problem. I can determine theme, and you can erase theme. So you are always having your same objective, but obviously you're changing the wording to the skill. What worked for me, so some teachers like that, what worked for me is I had it on my board. I had enough space, luckily. And I could write out, I can determine, and then I'd have a blank space. I can communicate and discuss. I can check my understanding. So these were written out on my board, and then I would write, I can understand, or I can determine, and then I'd have problem 1 week. And then when I'm done with problem, I can erase. I can determine theme. And then when I'm done with that, I can erase. So this also helps the students when they come in, they can think, or they can see, oh, we're learning problem today. And you're like, yeah, that's our new skill. So when you keep things consistent, students already know what is expected. If you want, you can have students read out loud the objectives. You could say, okay, we're going to read our objectives before the lesson. That's completely up to you, but you do want to make sure students know that these are their objectives and why they're learning them. Materials, I like to eventually, when I was able to, when I could plan a week ahead, I wrote out my materials so I knew what I had to be ready for. So you always want a formative assessment. My first year, I printed out cool formative assessments. I find just checking their understanding 1 to 3 or red, yellow, green is the quickest way for assessment, but it's completely up to you. But you want to make sure that you do have your formative assessment in there. Whiteboard and markers. Now, there was 1 year we ran out of paper and ink. So I always used whiteboard and markers. Super quick, super easy. And that way they're active learners in the lesson, right? It's not you're having to pass out paper, then their pencil's lost. I mean, there's just whiteboard markers done. Picture book. I am a cheerleader for picture books. Even in the higher grade, 5th and 6th, How easy is it to teach a skill using a picture book? All I have to do is read the book to my students, practice the skill, and then they can practice the skill on their own. When we have complex texts, that can feel overwhelming for students, especially our low students. So when we have picture books, we can quickly model a lesson, but also model that skill. That's a lot easier for students to see. Another nice thing is just buy a picture book. You don't have to buy a lot, just buy one at first, because I can model prediction with this. I can model problem and solution, and I can model theme. And this book is Too Many Carrots by Katie Hudson. This was the book I modeled with in the video Make Predictions. Very easy, great book. And then you want to include a graphic organizer when you can. This is very helpful for all students. You will think, oh man, those higher students, they're fine. But if you want something done a specific way, or you want them to show their understanding, you want to have a graphic organizer. If you think about it, there's a lot that goes into summarization, perspective. So you really want to help students the best you can organize their thoughts. And then the next part is vocab, words, and academic language. So when we think about where students struggle, a lot of the time it is academic language. So I want to make sure that I'm covering before the lesson. You can front load it, what the words we're going to be learning today are, and what the definition is. Now, there was a word in here, bewildered. I could, if I plan ahead of time, I know that that's going to come up. I might already discuss that with my students, or you could always have them guess what the word means and talk about it as well if you have more time. Many ways to do that, but you want to make sure you front load that vocabulary. And the next one, differentiation. That's a big word, but it's really important. So how are you going to make the lesson fit all learners? I like sentence starters. Another nice thing about sentence starters is I can model how to make a sentence starter. The problem is, right? And so I already model it out in front of my students. Them practicing how to write sentences is important in all grades. Even in higher grades, they don't write complete sentences. So we want to encourage that complete sentence writing. And it also takes that level of trying to work through everything away a little bit, so that way they can actually focus on the skill. Picture books with visuals are a really important way to make this accessible to all learners. When you're modeling and you're using vocabulary words, this is another great way to meet your learners. Think, pair, share. I always had students think, pair, share. It is extremely important for them to not only hear each other's ideas, but actually listen to what their partner has to say. And then guided handouts, if you choose to print out guided handouts. Graphic organizers are meeting all of your students' needs, and anchor charts. So I'm going to post what an anchor chart looks like here. And anchor charts are an amazing way to keep students interacting. Why? Well, one, it provides a visual of the lesson, and two, they can refer back to it anytime. So when we talk about anchor charts, you can keep them throughout the whole year. I've seen teachers laminate them. I was never that fancy, but I did keep them because you can always come back. So let's say that 2 weeks ago I taught theme. I want to continually keep practicing it. So this week I'm teaching problem and solution, but most likely every story you read has theme. So I'm going to say, okay, we practiced theme last week. Who knows what theme is? Does anyone know what the theme is? So you always want to keep prior and new learning connected. So the more connections students make, the better their learning is going to be. And then the last thing we have to really focus on is, what do students need to know? So let's say I'm teaching a lesson and you are the teacher, the curriculum is not the teacher. So there are times I have looked through the curriculum ahead of time, because remember, I plan out my lessons and I'm like, there's a lot of things in here my students don't know. So I might spend 1 or 2 days doing little mini lessons to teach those skills before we get to the big picture. So I want to know, what do my students need to know before this lesson, and how are they going to identify that, or do they need to know how to identify that? Okay, so let's say I'm teaching solution. my students need to know how to find the problem. Okay. So again, I always need to ask myself, what do my students need to know before teaching this? Mini lesson and teacher model. So this should be about 10 to 20 minutes. We don't want it to be too long and we don't want it to be too short. It's really finding that happy medium. I remember as a first year teacher, I didn't really know what to ask. I wasn't planning as much just because I had so much on my plate to begin with. But eventually I got to a point to where I knew exactly what questions I wanted to ask. And I also want to give some type of exploration to my students, meaning I don't want to hand feed them everything. So there are some things that I might give a little bit of information on, but then I also want them to make their own connections because you don't want to have too much explanation as well. So before a lesson, I always bring up background knowledge because background knowledge should connect with new knowledge. So I would ask, what do we already know about making predictions? And this can be really quick. You can have them write it out, or you can think, pair, share, where they think about it and then they share with a partner. And then you talk about it whole class. We want to start making the connection of what they're learning to a real world setting. So how does this connect to them? You can just simply ask, why do you think we learned this? It's really interesting to see what students will come up with. And if we really give them the chance to share, you'll be surprised on what they actually know. And then we want them to make their own connections because if it's connected to them, it's more likely to be interesting and to stick. And then we want to do our next part, which is during lesson. How am I going to model the skill? And the best way to do this is a teacher model. So here I have my book from the video on making predictions. I already have my sticky notes. So I went through and read out loud and I modeled the skill I was going to teach. And then I also had students do a we do, because remember, my teacher model is I do, we do, you do. So they also have a chance to do a we do together. This also helps me see if there's any misconceptions around the room or what I need to cover again. So this is also a great time to give a graphic organizer. And as a teacher, I am also modeling that graphic organizer. Now, there has been times I model a skill using a graphic organizer and then I might find something really cool and I give them that graphic organizer. It throws students off. Even if it looks a little different, just stick with the same thing. Remember, consistency is really important with teaching. And I always want to make sure my students are actively participating. So when I'm reading out loud, right, I tell them, right now you're not doing anything, so I just need you to listen for this first part. Then I'm going to have you participate, okay? So another thing that's important is when we're doing mini lessons, we don't want them just sitting there staring at us the whole 20 minutes, right? I might have them watch me for that first 5 minutes, but after that, they're actively participating as much as they can because that gives them more responsibility. And my class, we don't have a choice to just sit and watch for hours. They will be actively participating. If they don't know something, I tell them on your whiteboard, you have to write, I don't know, because that makes them be responsible for their learning. Okay. When students aren't actively participating, this is where we have behavior problems. This is where after you teach a lesson, they're like, I don't know what we're supposed to be doing. So I always teach active learning. You are listening. I also talk. What does listening look like at the beginning of the year? Even with 5th and 6th graders, what does listening look like? What does talking with the partner look like? Okay, so you want to make sure that they already have these skills before lesson. If you would like a classroom management video, I'd love to do one. But for now, those are just some little bits of information on ways to keep your classroom management so that way you can actually teach these skills. And then after lesson, how am I going to check understanding? Then how I plan the you do. How am I going to plan for the students' independent work? So we want our formative assessment. So I taught my teacher model. I'm done with that. The students did participate. And now they have to rate their thinking. You can do 1, 2, or 3, or you can do red, yellow, green. So if I talk about red, yellow, green, if I'm a red, I'm at a stoplight and I need some direction on how to move forward. If I'm a red, that means I'm working with teacher Jessica at the back table. If I'm a yellow, that means I'm working with a partner who's either a yellow or a green. And if I'm green, I can teach the skill. Now, sometimes I would ask, is there a green partner who wants to work with a yellow partner? And if your green partners don't want to work with a yellow partner, that's okay. I've made the mistake of being like, you are going to work with this partner. And I didn't say it like that, but I said, hey, can you work with Josh or whoever? This is just an example. And they'll say, I guess, right? And then what are they doing? They're not helping Josh. They're doing their work. So you want to make sure that they actively want to do this. If, let's say, you have 3 yellows, I may pull one student to the back table to work with me, and I just tell them, you're also my partner, okay? This is another important tip, is teach how to use or how to have partner skills early on in the year. So my students already know at this point how to have a partner, and then we talk about being responsible. So I'll say, okay, guys, if you are a yellow, I will let you pick your partners, but this is your time to learn because you're responsible for your learning. So if you can't work with that partner, I would encourage you to be honest. And I've had many students say, well, yeah, I shouldn't work with Leon because I don't pay attention and he's my friend. Great. Thank you for being honest. So we want to make sure that we discuss that ahead of time. And then when students are working with a partner or with me, or independently, they're using that same graphic organizer or they're using the same exact sentence starters that I use. So if I'm having them write throughout my teacher model, the problem is, this is what they need to be doing independently. The problem is, keep it as simple as possible, even in 5th and 6th grade. I have made the mistake too many times where I add in something extra at the end. Don't do it, okay? All right, so let's look at what they're doing now during the student practice. As I mentioned, they're going to be a red, yellow, or green. So when we have this happening, I set a timer on the board because when they're doing this part and they're practicing, because I'm no longer doing my teacher model, we want to make sure we have a set time because some students could take a whole hour. And if they don't finish, it's okay. Remind them, this is just a practice. If they don't finish, it is okay. In a classroom management video, I would talk a little bit more about what small group looks like, but this is just how to make a lesson. So I'm not going to do too much, but I'll just touch on, you really, really want to make sure that you explain to students, once I'm working with my small group, I do not want to be interrupted because trust me, you will have 20,000 questions in that small group. I didn't do this personally, but I know some teachers had a stop sign that they would literally put up and say stop if a student was trying to ask them questions, because you'll never get to small group at that point. And let's be honest, you have students asking you questions and then you're like, okay, how do I get back to small group? And then where were we and what's going on? And that time really needs to be focused on your small group. So I always would get small group started, maybe model again. Okay, so while we're working in group, when I was doing my teacher model, I was thinking, how do I make a prediction? And I use clues and information from the text. And this is the time students can communicate. So some students would be like, oh, this is where you were saying that rabbit ruined the bird's nest. And I'll be like, yes, great. And so this is really where they're kind of like partners, but we're in a group setting and I'm there as well. So they're open sharing and we're working together. So then I might be like, okay, guys, let's read this one together. Susie, will you read this? And she says, what is the problem in this story? So I'll say, okay, so remember when I did this part, okay? And then I'll say, now you guys go ahead, you communicate to each other. What do you think the problem is? And then this is where I would get up and I would walk around the room and I would check to see what students are doing. Now, a couple first years, I had a clipboard and I would check mark some students who I saw that got the answer done really well, or they may have a different answer, but it still might be correct. I'm going to mark that later on. I was able to remember it a little bit better, but this is where when we're meeting back together, I can pull those students. So let's talk about checking in skill. So when I'm checking in, this is where the end of the lesson or the timer has stopped. So it's been the 15 minutes. I say, okay, we're going to go back to our desks and we're going to review what we came back or what we came up with while we were working with a partner or alone or with the teacher. So when I was walking around, I saw Susie had the answer. Susie, can you share? I think this is way more powerful than me telling them, because this shows that the answer came from a student who is their peer, and it shows that they were able to understand this. So I do want to make sure, though, again, out of my 4 things you need to know, I have already done this or looked through it. So I already know what the answer is, and I already know how I'm going to explain it. So I may also see that Joey has a different, let's say he has a different problem. One thing about reading is there's a lot of times that students may not have the curriculum answer, but they'll have a correct answer. And so this is why I like to look ahead of time, because then I could be like, Joey's is a little different. Let's talk about Joey's. And I may ask the students, what do you think of Joey's answer? And they might be like, yeah, I can see that, being the problem because, okay, so I would say this actually happens probably 8 out of 10 times, that the curriculum does not always align with other things also in the text. So it's important that you know as a teacher that there are many shades of meaning in reading, and that students are going to have many different answers. Now, sometimes students are completely off, and that happens too. Then I know that student might need more review. Okay, so now that we have met back together and we reviewed that independent work time, this is where I'm going to do my wrap up. So I want to make sure I at least have 5 minutes left of my lesson to do a wrap up. Okay. So I'm going to say, okay, so during my teacher model, I taught you guys how to come up with predictions. I am going to now review this time. So I'm going to ask that we are not working. I ask our books are closed or our pencils are down, and I'm going to quickly review this for you as a wrap up review. When I'm looking for predictions, I'm using clues and information from the text to make my prediction. Then I go back and I recheck my answer. Was I correct or not? Because good readers use predictions, and good readers practice this skill. For me personally, I like using good readers, good writers, good mathematicians, okay? Because they want to know the skill, why we're learning these skills. These are skills of good readers. These are skills of good writers. So we want to encourage those skills. And then assessment. So this part would be probably the next day, because at this point you have done your teacher model, which has been 10 to 20 minutes. The students worked independently, which is 10 to 15 minutes. And you have done your wrap up about 5 minutes. So likely that's too much to ask them to do another assignment at this time. So let's kind of talk about what that may look like next. So the next day I would do that. I would spend 5 to 15 minutes, just depending on how long you get, to pull students one more time to review. Your other students in the classroom, they could be silent reading, or I would tell them, look at our assignment from yesterday, or go back and reread what was in our story yesterday, because their independent work is not going to be from my read out loud. Their independent work should either be from a printout or their curriculum. And then after that, I would give them an assignment so that you can grade. And so at this point, you have done a teacher model, you have modeled a skill, and you have done a think out loud. 2, they have worked independently, or they got more teacher one-on-one time in a group. And 3, they've had 2 opportunities now to rate their thinking. So I would definitely say they are ready to have their assessment. So at this time, I'm going to wrap up what we learned, and then I'm going to give you some real talk and opinions on making a lesson plan. So there's 4 things that you need to know before planning a lesson. And I would encourage you to take notes at this time if you weren't already. 1, know the skill I am teaching. What are my students going to be learning? What do I want them to know by the end of the lesson? Break it down to 1 skill. I know sometimes summarization can be a lot, so I might teach that in steps. Keep that in mind. 2, make sure that I am planning my lesson ahead of time. I've already read through what I'm going to model. I have sticky notes or some type of reminder on what I'm actually going to be covering. 3, assume my students know nothing. I'm going to go into every lesson and make sure I need to know what the students not only need to learn, but also, just in case, cover what they may not know. And 4, I make mistakes. That's completely normal. And as a teacher, I want to learn different ways to teach, and I also want to try, and that is also okay. All right, let's wrap up. How to make a lesson. You want to do mini lessons, 10 to 20 minutes. You want to decide how you are going to model this. After you model that, you're going to have students rate their thinking on a scale 1 to 4, 1 to 3, however you choose to do that. I like to make it as simple as possible on myself. And come back together. You're going to then review what they came up with. Then after that, you are going to wrap up. So you're going to spend about 5 minutes doing a wrap up, not very long. Wrap up what they learned. Okay, so this is where they're back at their seats. Everything is shut. Pencils are down. My wrap up is my time to talk. And then you can talk about now we're going to move on to something else or their recess or whatever. So that 5 minutes is really important. That's their wrap up. Then you can choose at this time to have them do another formative assessment at this time, or you can hand something out and then you can grade it the next day. Okay, that's the end of that. Now, next day comes along. You have taught this. You have taught this lesson. You have discussed it with your class, and your students have had 2 opportunities to rate their understanding. So, a couple things you can do. Those students that were in the red yesterday or yellow, you may pull them for 5 to 15 minutes to the teacher table. The other students, they could be silent reading. You can be giving them a task. They could get on Chromebooks and work on a math assignment or a reading assignment, or however you choose to do that. Okay. After that, you get their attention again. I do my 1, 2, 3 eyes on me. This is where they're going to get their assignment and you will get your grade. This will again show you level of understanding. So that is how to make a lesson plan. I hope this is helpful, and I hope that you caught some things to take away from this, okay? There's some things I didn't cover, such as making sure you have a teacher example. That would be part of you planning out your lesson ahead of time. And if you're doing a graphic organizer, you want to have your graphic organizer already done, but you're still modeling out how to fill out every little category because students need to see that, okay? So here is my real talk with you. It's okay to admit we make mistakes to students. There's times I tell students, you know what? I taught this lesson yesterday and half of you didn't understand. That's probably because I didn't teach it how I wanted to. So I'm going to reteach. It may be different. It may be somewhat the same, but I'm going to reteach. So again, it's okay to admit we make mistakes in front of our students. 2, you have to have your classroom management down, else you cannot teach. If you have students whispering in the back, if you have students getting up, if you have students doing what they want, they're not going to be active learners in their learning. So you have to have expectations for what you want to see as a teacher, okay? Again, I can make a classroom management video if you want, but that was a hard lesson for me, is making sure that my students were actively listening. You set how things are going to flow, so they really look at you. You'll notice sometimes things will happen in your classroom. A student will say something or do something, and your students look to you first because they're expecting a modeling behavior from you. So you want to make sure that you are setting your expectations in this class. The best advice I ever got from my lead teacher, sorry, my nose itched, from my lead teacher is, she would say, my expectation is sky high. I wouldn't say that, but I would say, my expectation is very high for you guys because I know you guys are the best learners around, okay? I like to keep it as positive as possible. I also like to say, if you don't know this skill after teacher modeling, that's okay because we're all learning. So keep in mind that we are working with little people that may not get that positive interaction at home. I had more growth when I did it that way because honestly, this is a hard skill for some kids, and some kids it's not, and some kids it is. So we want to teach them it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay if they don't know. That's how you're also going to get students to rate themselves honestly, is to teach it's okay to ask for help. I noticed in 5th grade, and 6, it's really hard for kiddos to ask for help. So you really, really got to push. It's okay if you don't know. It's okay to ask for help. Okay? And that is it. That was my real talk. So please put in the comments below what you want to see. I tried to get as much information in here as I could. I didn't really cover small group as much as I'd like to, or classroom management, else this video would be 2 hours long and about 6 hours of editing for my life. So if you want to see those videos, please comment down below. I'd love to make them. And I hope this helps, especially if you're a new teacher, or even if you're subbing for the day and you want to plan a lesson. That's always fun. I really, really look forward to seeing what you guys think and talking about teaching, because it is such a passion of mine, and I really look forward to that. All right, I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.